Marijuana Nation, just a quick bit of good news before we launch into the headlines today. As regular listeners know, our publishing schedule has been completely messed up since September due to school and COVID-related reasons, and we've only just been running 2 shows per week. I'm glad to announce that we'll be bouncing back up to 4 shows each week, Tuesday through Friday, starting in just a couple weeks once we turn over into March. So that will be just awesome. Stay tuned for that return to schedule. This episode of Marijuana Today Daily is brought to you by our friends over at Kova Software, the #1 dispensary point of sale system in North America. Swing over to kovasoftware.com today to see why 2/3 of all Canadian cannabis stores run on Kova Software, which is also the fastest growing dispensary software in the United States, with more than 100 new client dispensaries open for business in January alone. One more time, that's kovasoftware.com, with Kova spelled C-O-V-A. Good morning, Marijuana Nation. It's Tuesday, February 16th, 2021, and you're tuned in to episode 1021 of Marijuana Today Daily. I'm your host, Shay Gunther, and I'll be walking you through today's marijuana news and headlines. As always, we have a full and busy day of cannabis news in our hands, so let's jump right into it. Yesterday in New Mexico, a bill to legalize adult use marijuana was approved by the Health and Human Services Committee before being sent on for further deliberation by other committees. The legislation was introduced by Representative Javier Martinez and would set up a fully functional taxed and regulated marijuana sales program, complete with all the appropriate social equity provisions one now expects from good legalization. Home grow would be allowed at 6 plants per adult, and the legislation includes the automatic expungement of past cannabis crimes. There's been a lot of work in New Mexico behind the push for legalization, so I'd swing over to Marijuana Business Daily for more here and would keep the state on your general industry radar. With a well-developed medical program already installed, New Mexico could quickly move on rolling out adult use once the legislation to do so passes. We have a sadder headline out of South Dakota, where the state's Attorney General Jason Ravensborg has decided to stop defending in court the ballot measure approved by voters in November to legalize adult use marijuana, even though that is kind of his job. South Dakota suffers the misfortune of having a very right-wing GOPQ governor, Kristi Noem, who has shown her general disdain for democracy a number of times over the last year or so, and who you might remember from a recent headline where she decided to delay implementing the voter-approved medical marijuana program by a year because the issue is too complicated for her to understand. And I'm not being snarky there, that's actually what happened. That's the backdrop against which Attorney General Ravensborg just made his announcement that his office will not be defending South Dakota's adult use ballot measure against a lawsuit filed by prohibitionists in the state Supreme Court. Matthew Schweik at the Marijuana Policy Project told Marijuana Business Daily that he's confident that the state Supreme Court will ultimately find in favor of the people and uphold legal adult use, but we'll have to wait the appeal and subsequent judgment. Another good story to be following. Our buddy Ben Adlin, a new regular on our weekly show Marijuana Today, takes us out on our top stories on a more positive note than the previous headline, with Washington state lawmakers voting yesterday in the House Public Safety Committee by a vote of 7-6 to approve a bill that removes entirely all penalties associated with the possession of small amounts of all drugs. You should remember now that Oregon has stripped away all criminal penalties for having small amounts of drugs, but still does maintain a $100 fine, whereas Washington's new bill takes away all penalties, instead offering increased access to drug treatment programs for people who have issues with drug use. Another key difference in Washington is the fact that the reform is coming about via legislative action compared to Oregon's Citizens Initiative. The legislation, numbered House Bill 1499, now goes on to the Appropriations Committee before a possible vote on the floor of the House. Ben's story has lots of good detail and background and is worthy of a full dive in. As we always do, we have all the news we cover linked to on our website at mjtodaydaily.com. Those are the top stories for today. It's time for Marijuana Today Daily Headlines Blitz. Before we blitz it in headlines, let's quickly thank our sponsor, Kova Software, the #1 dispensary point-of-sale system in North America. There are a lot of reasons why Cova software is the #1 dispensary point of sale system in North America, but maybe none so important than its rock solid reliability with a 99.9999% uptime. That's 6 nines. And when it comes to performing over the all-important 420 holiday, Cova has 0 crashes, 100% uptime, and an average processing time of just 1.4 seconds each and every year. Think about your own dispensary's point of sales program and how that stacks up, and I think you start to get a sense of why Cova's software is proving to be so popular. Then stack up all the other benefits that being a Cova software client brings, and it starts to feel like one of those no-brainer questions. Do you need automatic compliance? Cova has that. Offline mode? Cova has that too. White glove launch service? You guessed it, Cova has that too. In addition to open APIs, scalability, fast and free support, and best-in-class partner ecosystems. Don't delay today and don't just take my word for it. Open up covasoftware.com and learn how Cova can make your business better. That's covasoftware.com with Cova spelled C-O-V-A. All right, time for the Blitz. Kyle Yeager over Marijuana Moment has a good update out of New York, where yesterday Governor Andrew Cuomo said during a press briefing that he would be sending a revised version of legislation to legalize adult use marijuana over to lawmakers this week, saying that while he and the legislature aren't quite lined up on all the important details, that they were, quote unquote, making progress. The main points of contention in the legalization plan that was earlier released by Governor Cuomo was the increased punishment and contain for anyone charged with providing cannabis to underage people, not quite the direction that legalization bills generally go. There's also been criticism that the governor's plan does not adequately address social equity issues. This is one of those stories that is just packed with context, so I'd dive into it in full if you have New York on your industry scope. The number of registered medical marijuana patients in Massachusetts has crested the 100,000 person mark, growing 30,000 or so people just in the last year alone. Medical marijuana dispensaries first opened up in the Bay State in 2015, and as Marijuana Business Daily has it, the number of registered patients was actually pretty stagnant in the previous year, growing by just over 1,800 people between March of 2019 and March of 2020. So there's something there. According to a new report, the number of legal marijuana jobs in the state of Michigan now tops the number of industry jobs in Oregon. Leafly's new 2020 jobs report is full of all kinds of useful insight and is worthy of a full open itself. But one of the more interesting points it picked up on is the 18,078 legal cannabis industry jobs in Michigan, topping Oregon's 17,981 by just a bit. Leading the list is, as you might have guessed, California, where a touch over 58,000 people make a living in legal marijuana. We turn to my own state of Maine for this next headline, as the state's Office of Marijuana Policy has released numbers for how the state's adult use program has been going since it launched in October. The most recent update shows that just under $2.5 million in sales were made in January, generating $247,000 in tax revenue. January's totals is more than double the $1.07 million sold in the first month of operations. The general sentiment in Maine seems to be that the adult use program rollout has been relatively free from disruption, with some supply issues seen in the opening days that have started to ease as more producers and manufacturers have been licensed. State lawmakers in Mississippi passed a bill late last week to legalize medical marijuana, which would normally be a good headline around these parts, but the circumstances under its passage make the legislation a little bit dodgy. Marijuana Moments republished a good piece on this from Jeff Pender from Mississippi Today, diving into Senate Bill 2765, which would set up a limited medical cannabis program, but only if a more progressive citizens initiative passed in November does not survive a legal challenge seeking its dismissal. There's a lot wrapped up in this one, so I'd read Jeff's story in full. The Canadian marijuana giant Canopy Growth just finalized its previously announced fire sale of 2 large greenhouse facilities in British Columbia that it's dumped hundreds of millions of dollars into, getting back just $31.5 million in the sale. This is part of the larger overall storyline of Canadian companies overextending their greenhouse growing capacities beyond market demands. And finally for today, we wrap up on kind of a funny story out of Washington State, where researchers at Washington State University have published a study looking at how marijuana affects people's creative energy. They found that entrepreneurs who consume cannabis do come up with more creative ideas after consumption, but that the ideas they do generate tend to fall on the more unrealistic side of the spectrum. That's just funny. Those are the headlines and news for the day. I'll be back with you again on Friday with another information-packed episode of Marijuana Today Daily. But in the meantime, if you have any stories to share or feedback to give, zip us an email to headlines@mjtodaydaily.com. And while you're clicking around the interwebs, swing over to our website at mjtodaydaily.com to find links to all the news we cover. Thanks to our sponsor, Kova Software, and to our awesome patron listeners for the support that makes this show possible. To join the illustrious ranks of the patron listeners yourself, swing over to our website at mjtodaydaily.com and click on that big blue button at the top of the page that says Become a Patron. I'm your host, Shay Gunther. Thanks for tuning in and starting your day with marijuana today. Today.
One take, Shay. One take.